Alright, let's bring September to a close with 5 more new movies. And this one kind of happened by accident because I had in mind the first 3 that I wanted to talk about, and I just happened to realize that all 3 of those were the third part in a franchise, so I figured why not keep that going, because I saw Creed 3 when it came out in theaters back in March, and then I just never got around to talking about it, so it made sense to just kind of throw that in there. And then I actually wasn't going to bother with Greek Wedding 3, and then this came up and it's like, well, if I'm already doing all the other, third parts of the franchise, I might as well check that out while I'm at it. So we have 5 movies from this year that are all the third part in their franchises. A couple of these seem to be playing themselves up as finales, but we'll see how that goes. I think I want to start with A Haunting in Venice, which Branagh's Poirot trilogy up to this point is something that I've been mixed on, because I did like and often find myself defending his Murder on the Orient Express, where it may not be like, the seminal production of it, but I feel like it's really, really good and has a really good cast to go along with it. Death on the Nile, I don't know if I could call like an outright disaster or anything, but his Death on the Nile really felt like it kind of fell flat, and I feel like the cast wasn't helping in that scenario. So here, expectations were just kind of, I don't really know where I guess they were kind of non-existent. But in preparation, I went ahead and read Halloween Party, the book that it's based on, which is really funny because kind of the strength of the movie is how much it abandons Halloween Party almost entirely. It kept names, but sometimes the names don't even match the characters. It's just like little, I guess you call them Easter eggs, as much as I hate the term, throughout. And like there's a bobbing for apples scene, I guess you could call it, in this movie, which is a reference to the murder that took place in Halloween Party, where it's the catalyst of the whole story and what Poirot is there to investigate. And just a number of things you'll find there. The presence of a garden plays a part in both of them. But apart from that, and the interesting thing about it also is that it was apparently being really played up in the advertisements as a horror movie, and like it was trying to almost trick audiences into thinking it was like a full-blown horror movie. And then people were kind of getting wind of that, and I started hearing word about people saying like, oh, it's advertised as a horror movie, but it's not that. It's definitely more of like a mystery thing and stuff like that. For people that like aren't familiar with Poirot or anything like that, or Branagh's whole other 2 movies, but I was surprised that I was so ready for a movie that wasn't a horror movie as was being told, and assumed I was getting something closer to the book that was just a regular investigation that has just an opening scene at a Halloween party and then nothing else is horror related at all. Um, they took it, they completely changed the book, and yeah, I would say this is pretty close to like a real legit horror. Like if people saw the advertisements, were expecting a horror movie, and came to see the movie, I don't think they'd be disappointed. I feel like they pretty much get a horror movie, and I found that really surprising and really refreshing, actually. I guess because it was so unexpected, and because doing an adaptation of the book would have been, it's not Christie's best horror story by any means. It's got some weird like moments in it and certain story points in it, but for the most part it does feel pretty disjointed and it's not very engaging. So to kind of take the beginning concept of it, the story happens at a Halloween party, and only this time it's like the whole thing. Like Poirot is like a guest at the Halloween party in this one, and then it goes from there, and the whole thing is kind of in this one location for the most part. And like I said, the changes actually feel like they're for the better, and to watch like Branagh and the writer sort of take this and take something that exists by a beloved author and then create something kind of original, like kind of completely their own with it, with just these tiny little details that come from the source material, and then that's about it. Um, and that's really fun to see that sort of how it's an adaptation, but kind of not really an adaptation at all. And that's actually fun when it's done well. Sometimes that can be really annoying, and it kind of took a minute for my mind to sort of register. oh, this is not the book at all. And once my mind got away from that, I was able to embrace the movie as its own thing. And then I was starting to actually like it much better once I came to terms with that. Um, and when you talk about the horror elements that are in it, yeah, there's a lot of stuff like it. I've actually heard also it's like it's minimal on the horror stuff. I don't think so at all. There's a shitload of jump scares in it, which I wasn't expecting. But less like the cheap jump scares and more of like you're on like a horror ride of sorts is kind of what it feels like. Because the production values are like through the roof on this one, which are a huge step up from all the CGI stuff that Death on the Nile was doing. The stuff where Death on the Nile looked way too sort of smooth and clean or whatever it was. Clean, not in the good way. Like fake, I think is what I'm trying to say. But also a lot of the imagery, like the masks and Michelle Yeoh's like entrance in general. The fact that it's set during a storm. There's so many elements here that feel so old-fashioned, which is interesting because I was talking about the clean look and the fake look that Death on the Nile had. This one is also, you can definitely tell that it's digital, but it's really interesting how they made it to where the digital doesn't really like clash with the old feeling that it has. It's like when I was talking about Belfast, where I still to this day don't really know how Brown shot Belfast because Belfast is a movie that's set in like the 60s, I think like the early 60s. And the movie, even in the theater, the movie looked like a 4K. And it's like and it looked amazing. Like I'm still just completely infatuated with how Belfast looked 2 years later. And this one kind of has that same feel where everything feels so crystal clear, but instead of looking fake like that typically does, you can really take in like all like the production design and the way it's shot and everything all the more clearly, and it just looks so good. And even this is like one of the best parts actually. When you talk about how he actually made the digital look really work, which is kind of hard to do, another thing that's really hard to do that he makes work is a lot of this movie is set in the dark. And so typically it's like, especially with horror movies, it's like, well, I can't see a goddamn thing when most of the movie takes place in the dark. So what's the point of all this? It takes place almost entirely in the dark, but you can still see everything clearly, but you still get the sense that you're in the dark, even though you can see pretty clearly. I'm actually not even quite sure how that was pulled off either. So that's, yeah, I just love this, and just in general, the real locations are really going to play a part. Like I said, especially after what we saw with Death on the Nile, where nothing looked real. It is to my understanding that they did use like fake sets and fake backgrounds occasionally, but just that sense of when it's beginning and you can feel the real locations, and it definitely feels like they're on like a real set with very minimal CGI, if any at all. It really makes a difference, especially with a story like this that's never really leaves the one place once they're in here. And it has that old-fashioned feel of Poirot saying, like, we all have to stay here until this all gets figured out. And it's fantastic. There's also, talking about the technical aspects of it, the editing also is really well done in this, and there's a particular moment where, obviously, since a lot of this is set around a seance at the beginning, and the fact that we know that Poirot stories aren't, like, supernatural, we know early on we're gonna get a scene where Poirot's just kind of debunking everything that seems like it's making it a horror movie, and this scene does come early, and it's like the editing in this scene especially, and it's like, and I love that they made all these changes and kind of gave this a whole different setting, while also Poirot always feels like Poirot's character. That's like the one thing that would you would hope refuse to deviate from, and that's what they did. They put their own little touches on him, like about where he is in his life at this point, but he's still completely true to the character, and that comes through in Brennell's performance also. And talking about the other performances, like speaking of Belfast, he's working with Jamie Dornan and Jude Hill again, who are playing father and son again. Um, Dornan doesn't get a lot to do, but he does have this. He has to have this sort of intensity and this sort of like kind of PTSD about him, because it is I can't remember when the book is set, but here it is like this post-war setting, and so you have that post-war feel kind of looming over everybody, especially characters like Dornan's character, and then how that affects Jude Hill, who's his son. And Jude Hill especially, we praised him a lot when we were talking about Belfast, but here it's like, even though he's a child, he might as well be another adult character. And the way that he's able to handle roles like that without seeming like the annoying, precocious child part that we saw way too many times at a specific time, where he's still an engaging character despite the fact that he doesn't act like a kid at all. And that would seem it's not like the way M. Night Shyamalan does that, where every like kid in an M. Night Shyamalan movie seems like an alien that just doesn't speak like a child at all. And here it's like so it's just almost it's funny when you have the horror aspect because it's almost like he's possessed by like an older person or something. Like it doesn't go down that kind of path or anything. That's not spoilery or anything. That's just the way the performance comes off, and it actually really works with the character, especially since he kind of he had to mature at a young age to take care of his dad because his dad's going through PTSD. And I said the character work as it goes on. Michelle Yeoh's having a great time here, being the one that puts on the seance, and it's like it's great. Like usually you worry about what kind of role somebody's going to take on right after they won an Oscar. And Michelle, this is a fun. It's nice to see she went like to a fun part. I'm going to assume this was probably shot before she won her Oscar, but still. Usually it's like a sort of make or break thing, your next role, and this is just a good time. So another thing as far as the technical aspects go, I was surprised to find, especially for what feels like a horror movie, there's not there's not a lot of score that I noticed. That's typically not something I notice anyway. But like I don't typically notice scores like first when I watch movies. But I felt like I noticed that there was like a lack of score that was actually really effective, especially when you have just the ambiance of the storm outside, kind of acting as its own score anyway. Is really great. And like I said, and you've got those horror elements like the jump scares and stuff like that, where it's I guess it's because so many jump scares were so unexpected in a movie like this that I found myself actually enjoying them. There's even a bird jump scare a lot, and I imagine it's not a coincidence that it looks exactly like the jump scare bird from Citizen Kane. Like I'm assuming it's the same type of bird. So I'm assuming that's an homage of some kind. So yeah, I get the only thing where it was kind of losing me towards the end was they do, without saying too much, they do bring in some ambiguity, I guess you could say, but the direction they're taking it is so well done anyway and such a good choice for the story. I feel like it's kind of unnecessary to bring in ambiguity the way that they do when we get to the end, but there's not too much emphasis on it, so that's still it's not working too against its favor, but I feel like they could have been a bit more just kind of straightforward with where the story ultimately ends up, rather than kind of trying to like I said, I guess that's part of throwing in the horror elements of always having that ambiguity. But that apart from that, though, this is really well done and a really nice surprise, and I would like to see it again, knowing now how much it's just not the book, because that's something that kind of, like I said, it took me like at least the first act to kind of get away from that. So I'll probably like it even better the second time around, and yeah, a lot of people are building it up as it's the best of the three of Brown's Poirot movies, and that seems right. I don't think I've seen Murder on the Orient Express since the theater, which was like 6 years ago now. But like I said, I do remember liking it well, but I don't. The fact that that movie pretty much just kind of is what you expect from it for the most part, and then to have the surprise element of this being something completely different from what you think it's going to be when you go in, is it adds that sort of excitement to it and that freshness to it. So that was quite satisfying, and I'm such a huge fan of Branagh anyway. This is also much like Michelle Yeoh. This is, I think, his first outing since he won his Oscar also for Belfast screenplay. So, which I love. I can't get enough of saying that Kenneth Branagh's an Oscar winner. Even 2 years out, it's like I'm still just on a high from that. So, So that's great and satisfying. And I'm glad he was really able to bounce back in a big way from Death on the Nile. That's very satisfying as well. Um, so let's go on to the Equalizer 3, which I was super excited for because I I did really like the first movie. I didn't like it as much at first, but I think I just hyped myself up too much for the first movie. But the first movie has definitely grown on me, and I've seen it multiple times and really like it. I loved the second movie. The Equalizer 2 is fantastic and has so much like heart and emotion, but like the action, like everything is sort of above and beyond in the Equalizer 2, and I love that movie so much. So going into this one, the bar is high, but I like that, kind of like we were just talking about with The Haunting in Venice. This one takes a different direction, another one that I wasn't kind of expecting, where we do start with what we're expecting, and I like the fact that, first of all, I like the fact that these movies are like episodic in nature, where it's not really some continuous story, where it is just like it's what it promised with the setup at the end of the first movie, where it's just like he takes on assignments, and then that's pretty much what this has been up to this point. And so when it starts, I love that we get these like bad guys coming in, and it's like a reverse of the end of the first movie, where when he went, he killed like the main guy at the end of the first movie, and then when he walks through the house, like you just see all the dead bodies from where he came through that we didn't see. It's like a reverse of that is the opening scene of this one, where it's the bad guys coming in and they walk through and they see just the field of dead bodies that he's left behind until they find him in the house. And the way it just builds up McCall like that. And it's like, even though we know the character so well at this point, to still get glimpses of him from the bad guy's perspective and how scary he is just really fun. So, and then to see whenever the action breaks out is just this really great punctuation mark to the good build up that they can do. Um, the unexpected thing that happens here is that McCall is injured very early on, and I wasn't sure where they were taking it from when this scene happened, but I didn't realize him being injured and kind of being partially immobile was going to be a very large portion of the movie. And if somebody had just told me that without me learning it in the context of the movie and then seeing how the movie plays out, I probably would have been really put off. I feel like it did me a lot of favors to not really know anything about where this one was going when I went in. So the fact that like an hour, maybe over an hour of the movie is him like recuperating and trying to find his strength again after this injury, as like obviously we have bad guys coming in and we're forming a reason he's going to have to come back into action, and these are particularly bad guys too. Like I was kind of at first I was concerned that it wasn't like a big name playing. There weren't any big names playing the villains in this, so I was like, oh, how much are they really trying to build them up? Because I feel like if you want to really build up a villain as a big threat, the first thing you would do is cast somebody that you know the audience will immediately feel as a threat. So um, I would, but that honestly went away pretty quickly when you see in these first few scenes just how bad these guys are and how soulless they are. There's a point in time where there is like a public suicide that they have basically caused, and they just have no reaction to it whatsoever. If anything, they have like a reaction of contempt to it, if anything. And they set them up to be so incredibly hateable and despicable, and that's exactly what you want when you know that McCall is eventually. There's no way this movie gets to the end without McCall eventually getting back into action. And it's really, not only is it satisfying to feel that build up and know that it's inevitable, but what they do in the meantime is also really crucial to this movie. So it's like, this movie could have been just a drag for an hour, but to watch him interact with everybody and kind of find this sort of tranquil place and set up this tranquil life for himself. And because we know before from what we've seen in the opening, like the first act of the first movie, is this is what he always wanted to begin with, was to leave this behind and live this sort of peaceful life. and that he finds it in like this new location with new people, and watching him integrate himself, where at first he's an outsider and it's like maybe people aren't sure about him, they don't really get his ways, and he's kind of trying to find his way in theirs, and then to watch the progression of him becoming one with this community by the time we get to the point that the action's going to come back. And that was a lot more intriguing and involving and engaging than I probably would have expected if I had known this is what it was when I went in, without seeing it for myself. And I imagine some people might be disappointed with the movie because of how much of the movie is that. But just kind of watching him embrace and be embraced by this place full of love and like camaraderie, you almost kind of forget it's like an Equalizer movie. And I know that sounds like something you would not want at all, but like I said, there's just enough of these hints in it of like, the bad guys, and there's this other thing going on with Dakota Fanning and David Devon play like the authority like figures. I can't remember if they're like FBI or CIA or something. They're one of the letter organizations. And I feel like, well, of course it's nice that we have the Man on Fire reunion with Denzel and Dakota Fanning. I keep wanting to call her Elle. It's Dakota. I feel like we haven't seen Dakota for a while outside of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, so I have to get used to saying her and not Elle, who's always busy. But yeah, it's a Man on Fire reunion, and they're together here, and it's nice, but I feel like, with the exception of like the very end, you could cut out Dakota Fanning's character entirely and everybody she works with entirely, and just focus on the Denzel stuff, because the way she kind of comes into the end, I feel like the audience would have bought it if it was just like, oh yeah, that whichever organization he works for, I can't remember, they would come into it right about this time. And we didn't, like, everything in between, we could have just seen McCall more or less working alone, because that's typically what he does anyway. He would have, like, a David Harbour from, like, the first movie that he would kind of intimidate into helping him, but as far as, like, having... And it might seem like, oh, maybe he needs a helping hand because he's recuperating and stuff like that and starting a new life. But I don't know, I still would have... I feel like the movie would have been just fine without the Dakota Fanning stuff. With just focusing on him and the villains. And everything would have been satisfying enough and would have still made sense as far as a story's perspective and how it progresses. But then what I love about it also is that the movie knows what you've been waiting for, even though it handles this stuff really well, where it's kind of died down a little bit and more calm. Because, like I said, I think especially because they make the bad guys so hateable, that when the moment finally comes that we're waiting for, where McCall comes back into action, it's not like he has to find his way back. He has to like kind of reteach himself to fight or anything like that. When he comes back, it's an avalanche. Like, it gets very no bullshit very quickly, and it's so satisfying because, like I said, because the build up and the times where he wasn't in action were working just fine by themselves, you almost forget how much you were anticipating, alright, I need to see him kicking ass and killing people again. And so when it comes, it gets very relentless, very fast, and you could tell there was a build up to it. There's one moment I can imagine people having problems with, where there's a moment where he seems, it's very fleeting, but he seems to really be taking pleasure in killing people in a way we haven't seen in the other two movies. Because in the other two movies we get the vibe that he didn't want to come back to this life. It just he kind of fell into it, and then it was I'm only doing this because I feel like I have to. Rather than getting like pleasure out of it. But there's like one fleeting moment where he's like, we see him smile in a way we've never seen him smile before while a violent scene is happening. But while that might seem like it betrays the character, the reason I think it works is it feels like, to me, the way I took it was that it shows why he got out initially. Obviously, he made the promise to his wife before she died and stuff like that, but when you see how that may have been what he was before he was dragged into it, when he was just in it, without having been dragged into it, um, that's probably the kind of killer that he was. And to see that coming back, and it's like the way we can see, and the way that sort of contrasts with, the peaceful life that he's found and the life that he really wants. And you can see a real character conflict here in a fleeting moment, and that's the way I took that. But I can understand if people get kind of put off by that moment. But I feel like it works when you look at the whole big picture of where he came from and what he's been through up to this point. And so it's like almost he was in it so much that when he took like a long break from it, the old him came back, and that's why he seems especially relentless here. There's a decapitation in this one. I think that's the first time in this series somebody's head has come off. That's how much McCall comes back when he comes back. So I can really appreciate that. And then honestly, that what I just said especially I think makes the ending more satisfying and makes sense that that's the way that it ends. And the fact that this could you could say it's still open, but it feels like a conclusion to this. And I know some people were like, being snarky and saying like it's because Denzel's getting older that McCall isn't as physical in this one. But it's like, when you look at that also, even though I feel like the story works as it is, and it doesn't feel like it's trying to go around anything. It feels like the story it was always meant to be. It was supposed to be. But, if you want to look at it as, Denzel's aging and stuff like that, and McCall's aging, it would make sense if this was kind of a conclusion, and it would be a satisfying one if it was. So that I think that's pretty much how I feel about the Equalizer 3, which I don't love it as much as the second movie, but I might prefer it to the first one. I'm not I think so, but they're pretty close. But the second one is still king to me. So let's go on to Guardians of the Galaxy 3, which I was a little concerned about because I've been saying a lot lately that I'm just really burnt out on the MCU stuff and have been for some time. I was really, really into it for such a long time. But then right around the time of Moon Knight is when I finally kind of got worn out and tired, and I was just like, just get me as far away from anything MCU. I would literally rather watch anything than an MCU movie for the foreseeable future, is basically how I felt around the time of Moon Knight. And it just so happened the movie started getting worse too. So I didn't think James Gunn was going to make a bad movie or anything. But I just I didn't really come to this with I didn't come to this with my, oh my god, I'm so tired of the MCU attitude, but I wasn't like particularly psyched for it either. So maybe that was the best way to go into it, because I feel like this is a movie that's gonna obviously everybody's seen it by now, because this review's super late. But I imagine it feels like it exceeded expectations, and even with people who were like really hyping it, the directions he takes it feel pretty surprising as far as how emotional they get, but also the dark places that it goes, while also still feeling completely in the spirit of itself. And this was another one where it was like they were kind of building it up to be this sort of closer to at least this part of the franchise. And so, we're introducing a lot of characters also, despite that. Like, Adam Warlock was obviously built up in one of the post-credit scenes of the second movie. And then, of course, Will Poulter is playing him. And I was surprised by the abruptness of his entrance, and the fact that what he does here is the catalyst for the whole movie, where he ends up severely injuring Rocket. And then from there, it essentially becomes a Rocket movie, I guess you could say. Like, it was interesting because when Rocket's first taken out of commission, you think, oh, that they just wanted to write out Rocket or something. Like, is Bradley Cooper like super busy or something to even do voice work or something? But then it's like, it surprises you that even though Rocket is out of commission for most of the movie, through flashback, it manages to still make it basically a Rocket-themed movie. But what's great about that also is sometimes it might seem like it's deviating a little too much when you have such an ensemble of characters and you make the movie about a specific character. But even though you could say it's a Rocket-themed movie, more or less, which is perfectly fine because Rocket's always been one of the best characters, but it still very much feels like an ensemble, and there's still plenty of things all the other characters have going on here. I was a little put off by the 2.5 hour runtime when I first learned about it, but it packs a lot into that runtime, and like all the characters are still getting just as much love as before. We're getting even more emotionally invested in them even after, because the second movie I thought did a great job of really getting us more emotionally invested in the characters and having like a showing like a real heart to it that didn't feel forced at all in any way, and it didn't feel like it was trying to sort of like sometimes you can feel maybe trying to lure you in with beating you over the head with you feel for our characters, like all that. Everything felt authentic with those characters and the directions they ended up going, and the little twists that they put into it. And that's carrying over, and the characters are just continuing to get stronger in this one. And I think that's also helped a lot by the fact that we have a pretty big bad villain here. That's one of the criticisms the MCU got for a long time, was that the villains weren't very strong. And one of those things about superheroes in general is superheroes have to be great and fascinating in their own right, but they need a villain to match them. And oftentimes villains tend to better heroes, especially in like the DC universe. But here we do have the High Evolutionary, who is one of the even outside of the MCU, it's got to be one of the most unhinged villains I've seen for a while. And that's like there's a lot of things when you look at the MCU and the way the fan base talks about it, where things can tend to be sort of over exaggerated. Where it's like they'll say something is really really super dark, and then it's like, well yeah, compared to other MCU movies, yeah, but movies in general, not really. It's all pretty tame. Here, in particular, not just the darkness that comes with these plot points with the High Evolutionary, but there was a particular emphasis on warnings about animal cruelty, and like people who love animals should really, really go into this movie with caution. And that's something I was surprised to find wasn't really exaggerated. Because it's like, because I kind of had something in mind of what that was probably referring to, but there's more than that. It gets relentless for a little bit, for animal lovers throughout it. Pretty much any scene set in any area with the High Evolutionary is gonna be can be really hard to watch sometimes, particularly for that. And that's something where I actually feel like it's not very exaggerated. Um, but talking about the other side of that, where the MCU movies can also have that problem with having too much comedy in them, and they can't seem to live in a dramatic moment for too long, and they'll have this moment, and they just the more relentless the comedy is, the more it falls flat, and it's like, and you don't even know why it's in there, and there were moments here where I was alarmed, like there's the moment when they get sidetracked when they're talking about the buttons and all that, and Quill talking to Gamora and how everybody can hear it, and that goes on for a very long time, and to the point where Nebula has to come in and say, like, can we get back to the task at hand? And it's like, if you have to write in that a character says, can we get back to what's going on here, you've probably gone way too off the path. And it's another thing that this movie is 2.5 hours, which is going to really make those scenes stand out, where it's like, okay, if it's 2.5 hours, you better make it count. And when we're watching like this scene with the buttons, it's like, don't cut this, please. But the thing about it, though, also as far as the comedy in regards to Guardians of the Galaxy movies specifically, I have defended it because the idea of James Gunn in general is that he comes from like this very black comedy background, and you can find that in like all of his movies. Even if it gets very, very, very dark, but they all kind of have a comedy element to them. And so when you look at the other MCU movies having these comedy elements in them, despite mainly being like action and sci-fi, the reason I feel like it was always appropriate for Guardians of the Galaxy is comedy is basically one of the main genres of Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, it's not like the characters are all doing comedy relief. They're comedy characters in a comedy movie that has, you know, dark emotional moments and, you know, sci-fi and action stuff like that. Like, it's sci-fi and action, you know, at the forefront, but comedy is like right there alongside that with the Guardians movies. So that is where it makes sense, where comedy is inherent to the characters and these three movies in general. But still, it can you still should probably know when to cut it down a little bit, especially when the movie's reaching 2.5 hours. But I don't. There's also the moment where Quill relates the entire story of him and Gamora to this alien woman, and he goes through the whole thing, and it's like we've already had a lot of recapping the Gamora stuff throughout the movie already, and so to do, and I think they were kind of trying to recapture the magic of the scene where Quill and Thor are exchanging tragedies in Infinity War, and how that scene works so well because we saw those stories play out and how tragic and sad they were, but then they were kind of thrown into this comedic moment where they were having a duel of tragedies. But this is just Quill telling us all the stuff that we already know and recapping stuff that not only we already know from other movies, but they've already been talking about in this movie. So that's something that goes on for way too long. That's way too unnecessary. But that's not. But still, a lot. There's a lot of funny stuff in here that actually works just fine. Also, like I think it works more often than it doesn't, and that's more. It seems more appropriate and right for the moments that they're in than it does when I'm begging them to cut that stuff. So, and like I said, we've still got a whole bunch of other stuff going on here. Also, like when they do the Gamora conflict and the way they handle her, I was a little concerned about that because obviously I've been saying for years now, like at least since the X-Men movies, how much it drives me crazy that nobody stays dead, and how Fast and Furious has picked that up, and like every franchise has picked that up now. And so the way they utilize Gamora was going to be really sort of almost make or break for a good portion of the movie. Where it's like, if you bring Gamora back into the story, it's going to completely ruin what went on with Thanos, and it's going to feel like such a cop-out. And so when she comes in and she's very antagonistic for a lot of it, and she really sticks to her guns as to not being the character that he fell in love with and that fell in love with him. That she is the Gamora before they like knew each other in the first movie, and she was kind of an enemy a little bit. She certainly started on the wrong side. And the way it really sticks to its guns with that is something that I really like, and the conclusion that comes to also, I found pretty satisfying. So where like it still has a heart to it, but like I said, sticks to its guns, which I was really appreciative of. And talking about the way they handle things that seem like they're questionable on the surface, I was concerned about Cosmo at first because I did see the poster, and when you see Cosmo, it's like, oh, the Guardians have a dog sidekick, and oh, it's a talking dog sidekick. But when you see it, first of all, I love the fact that there's no like introduction or anything, and they don't try to integrate Cosmo into the group. Cosmo's just a character they all know when the movie starts. Like we skip past all of that. And then the fact that not only is this character actually quite funny, like I actually like the running joke with Kraglin and the bad dog comment. And it's like, and it makes you like kind of sympathetic to Cosmo, even though Cosmo is just kind of here and there throughout most of the movie until the end. And yeah, it's just a nice additional comedic character that doesn't take away from anything and doesn't feel too forced in either. So that was really surprising. I wasn't expecting to leave the movie liking Cosmo as much as I did, especially with how absent she is for a lot of it. Maria Bakalova's voice work is probably helping that a lot also. So there's that. Nebula continues to be... I really didn't care about Nebula in the first movie, and I think went on kind of a tirade about how much I hated Karen Gillan's performance, because I wasn't a Karen Gillan fan for a while in like the first few movies I saw her in, but now I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Nebula is one of my favorite characters in the MCU. I think not just the Guardians movies. I even have I'm looking right now at like a little figurine I have of Nebula over there. And so I love the way and that character's still like the funniest character in the movie. Just her hatred towards her impatience towards everything will never not be funny, and especially in those moments like when after we've been doing the Gamora thing and Gamora says something like, it sounds more like you're talking about Nebula, and there's that moment where Quill looks at Nebula and it's like he's actually considering like, what if Nebula was a romantic possibility, and then she shuts that down immediately. The stuff like that actually works for me, and of course it wouldn't be a James Gunn movie without Nathan Fillion doing something here. So all that stuff is funny. Um, I also like how Crichton has an arc that's really been working here and comes to this nice sort of emotional peak. Like it's one of those things where, like I said, it feels like it's really Rocket focused, and that is the emotional core of the movie by far. And those scenes are the ones that are like, the hardest to watch and the most heart wrenching. But also giving a background to what's going on here to give that more depth once we get into the action portion of the movie. But yeah, it's all spread out as far as people getting their arcs and getting more emotional depth and all that. Obviously, Mantis has a lot of good scenes. Drax has a lot of great scenes. And yeah, so establishing this and making us continue to love the characters this much, it brings us to a pretty great last half hour where we've set up all this emotion behind all the characters, and it just basically this last half hour is just one great moment after the other, which is especially refreshing because MCU movies are kind of notorious for their action finales basically just being white noise, which has gotten extremely tiresome. So to see a climax here that's just like individual great moments is just really satisfying, and I love everything about the last half hour or so of this movie, and the fact that we have as many emotional payoffs as we do like action sort of payoffs, like satisfying action scenes. So this in general was just really satisfying in a really surprising way to me because like I said, I felt so burnt out on the MCU, but this one was pretty easy to like quickly, and then it just really kept up that energy for the most part. And we bring in some new interesting locations, especially like the Earth replica planet. Is interesting, and we got a lot of like really different and specific character design. There's like different unique character designs everywhere in the foreground and the background and everything. And I also love that when we had the opening scenes, I kind of thought Will Poulter was going to be underutilized. And so, kind of like what I was thinking with Rocket when they kind of put him out of commission before I realized where the story was going. And the fact that Warlock gets like a whole arc in himself also was really unexpected. So yeah, I was really into this, and like I said, that high that it leaves me on after the last half hour almost makes me forget pretty much like any other criticism I'd have about it. But the MCU is kind of known for that also. Like Endgame's finale will make you forget a lot of things that aren't so great about Endgame, but it leaves you with Endgame still feels like a great movie because of what it leaves you with, which is still really crucial. So I was relieved and happy with how much I really like this one. So let's go on to Creed 3, which I saw in the theater like 7 months ago, or almost 7 months ago. And like I said, I don't know if I just kept forgetting it was this year or what, but to talk about it in a very long delayed fashion, yeah, so Michael B. Jordan is directing now, and I like the fact that you can definitely see him taking on his own style and kind of putting his own sort of fresh visuals and ideas into it. But it does also feel like he was trying to keep the spirit of like Ryan Coogler here, because I think Creed 2 was a different director also, but you can kind of see him sort of making sure those like Creed 2 I think was a different director, but they kept the spirit of Coogler enough that it's kind of hard to tell. You can Coogler is a unique director where you can kind of tell that it's his stamp. But when you're doing like a franchise like this that you want to keep like a consistent feel, it is a good idea to kind of make sure you're keeping the spirit of the other director. So for Jordan to do that while also bringing in his own sort of thing to say like, I can do this, It actually works quite well together, and you can see what he's kind of learned along the way, and he's using to benefit the movie. It does seem like there might be something missing here with Stallone not being here and Rocky not being in it. But a couple of things are, number one, when you hear the stories, you can completely understand why Stallone isn't in this. Mainly the fact that Erwin Winkler is just acting very old and greedy. But also, I feel like it doesn't feel too out of place because of the way if I remember correctly, when we left Rocky in the second Creed, he went to like Canada to be with his kid. And so to imagine that he's just kind of there, I think he's only mentioned in passing like once or twice. So even with how this, even though they may not have foreseen at the time that Stallone wouldn't be in a third movie, it almost seems like they were setting that up at the end of the second movie. That if these events should play out and they wouldn't have Rocky in them, we know where Rocky is and what he's doing, and that he's in a good place. So I feel like that's satisfying enough. I did hear some complaints that there's certain events in this movie that you would think Rocky would come back for, but and I'm good with him just kind of being with his kid until Stallone would want to do anything with this again. So, like I was talking about with Jordan taking on his own sort of visuals, I do like that we get the fights like we typically do, but we also get much closer and more intimate with them, where we get like some POV shots, and to where we can see like his planning, like how specifically he's gonna hit and where he's going to. And it's like maybe it's a little too stylized, but there's still like I can understand him wanting to like freshen things up with it, and I feel like he does accomplish that for the most part. But it does make you kind of miss with how stylized the fights get in this one and how up close and personal the fights get in this one. You do kind of miss the sort of full shots where we really get to see the fight in full, like the way a crowd would, where it's like we're closer than a crowd would be, but we still feel like we're seeing like a full fight with the whole context of it being in this big arena and all that. Or like the one take fights in the first movie, stuff like that. I do tend to miss, but like I said, also him putting his own fresh style on it is something that we would want to see him do, because it would have to be an event, because this is him directing for the first time, and it's a character he's obviously really emotionally involved in at this point, and so yeah, seeing his own touches is fine. But I do think we'll talk about the end fight also, but I do think it could have benefited more from seeing it from a more outsider perspective. But I also like how much of the focus is on his family here also, with Tessa Thompson here and Felicia Rashad getting some really good moments in him talking. It's interesting when you think about him and the Creed family in general, how like he looks like Michael B. Jordan. I don't think he didn't really do anything to his appearance to change it or alter it or anything, but just Michael B. Jordan looking like Michael B. Jordan. There were moments in this movie where I was stopping and saying like, wow, he really looks like Carl Weathers. So I love that feeling of him really feeling like the son of Creed in multiple ways. And like we get these really nice and tender moments with his daughter, and the sign language scenes and stuff like that give it this sort of intimacy also. I do think this thing they kind of go into about his daughter fighting at school and kind of taking on those fighting characteristics, that might be one storyline too many, because there's still a clear focus here, and it brings on plenty of other side conflicts in itself, because we do have Jonathan Majors playing his old friend from childhood, and every build up to this movie has told us that this movie will conclude. What the movie's building up to is them fighting each other in the ring. And I was surprised to find when I saw the movie that there's a lot. That's a very late development that they're going to fight each other. There's a lot of build up and a lot of story that gets us to that point, which I can really appreciate. And what's really great about what Majors does here, who is really just phenomenal in this. He's really great about giving us constant conflicting feelings about Dame, his character, because Dame is clearly coming from a place where he went to jail for almost 20 years for essentially like defending um, Adonis. And so the idea that it's like they have this connection, but he also kind of feels like Adonis owes him at this point. And so when they come into this, and Adonis is like this, huge fighter who's on the verge of retirement and is at like the peak of fame, and has the boxing royalty in front of him, behind him, and it's like it's everything Dame wanted, and Dame has spent nearly 20 years in prison helping him, essentially taking the fall for him, essentially, or the way he sees it. And so we get these moments where we're not sure for a while if Dame is just coming from a place of misplaced anger, or if he's gonna go full blown villain. And the way he kind of goes back and forth, and the way he's able to make us have conflicting feelings about him constantly, where it's like every time we're like, oh, this guy really needs to get knocked out. He needs to get put in his place. He needs to really get taken down a notch and really come back to some form of reality without all this misplaced rage. And then he'll turn around and you'll feel like whether it's just a look or a situation or whatever, or just a look in his eyes, you just really feel for him. You feel so sympathetic towards him, and it's like it's so back and forth. Like in the 1 minute he can be almost full blown villain, and then he'll just give it's like there's this one particular moment, where after he's won a fight in this kind of dirty way, and it's like we see like, oh, this guy is probably bad news, and he doesn't feel like he's an honest fighter, and it's like I think this is gonna go a bad direction, but then like he looks at Adonis for like approval, and it's like one of the most heartbreaking looks that you can see, where there's almost a pathetic quality to it that makes you feel sad. But then he can turn right around and go right back into villain mode. And what's interesting is something that I thought was going to be totally exaggerated was, I can't remember if it was Michael B. Jordan or a review or something, but that there was like the movie used Cape Fear as an influence, and I was surprised to find that you can see it. Like, I mean, maybe it's a little exaggerated, but you can see it. You can see the influence of Majors being like a De Niro character and Jordan being like a Nick Nolte character, and the way he sort of integrates himself back into his life, but them knowing their history and knowing that one was in prison kind of because of the other, and there's something sort of, and him kind of him being envious of his life and wanting to get into it and maybe change it, and eventually be the one that comes out on top. And it's wild how much you can make that comparison. And I love how much they build up what this rivalry becomes, and how like naturally they do it. Where where it goes into like a Showtime sort of documentary thing, like a Showtime video package, and like the whole thing feels like this real fight, that you'd be watching from afar and building it up to. But we have all the emotional investment because we've seen the steps up to this point. So it's really satisfying as we're building to that ultimate conclusion of this is a fight that sort of has to happen. And there's nothing really too contrived about how it gets to that point. The only thing here, interestingly, is it does feel like some stuff in the middle was cut out in regards to Dame's sort of rise to like a luxurious lifestyle. Like, yeah, he does have like a big win in the middle that probably made him rich, but it just kind of feels like he's the guy that we knew at the beginning, and then there's just a cut, and then he's like living in a mansion practically. It feels like there was some stuff cut out of there, and it's like for a franchise that's known for its montages, you could have thrown in a little montage there of Dame getting into his life of luxury and kind of seeing that, change in his mind a little bit, as he kind of goes more into villain mode. But like, yeah, so you could have taken out some of the daughter stuff and the daughter wanting to fight stuff, and maybe put a little more of the Dame stuff in there. Especially since this big fight is what we're really leaning towards. And there is another moment here that's kind of... There's a conflict here that's kind of goes in a predictable direction involving Drago, like the son of Drago, who he fought in the second movie. There's a development with Drago that goes in this direction that's like a big story, like it leads up to something that's this big story turn, this big reveal of a moment, and it's very predictable from the get-go what happened here. But I will say this is a moment where I was kind of glad that it was predictable, because it was one of those cases where if it wasn't what exactly it seemed to be that they were hiding from us, it would have just been this really random plot convenience. So I was actually relieved when it ended up being like something really predictable. So without saying too much of what that is, that's how I felt about that. But then yeah, when it gets to this fight, I do understand the idea of it being this totally personal fight and adding in like the jail concept to it, where Dame comes from, and this prison that he's been in for so long. This idea of having it in this gigantic stadium, and then this moment where like, for symbolic purposes, like the crowd disappears and they're like in a cage in a cell, and then that's where a lot of the end fight takes place. And it's like, I get that from telling the personal story aspect, but like I said, it might, for my taste, it might be a little too over stylized and a little too beating you over the head with the symbolism. So that's, I wasn't sure how I felt about that, but it's all there. The stakes are there, the history behind them is there, and it's a satisfying conclusion ultimately, with some kind of heartwarming moments also and some poignant moments. And yeah, despite the fact that I said that we were missing a montage about Dame's rise to fame, we do get training montages as it's leading to this also. So we're getting all of the stuff that we want out of a Creed movie and even out of a Rocky movie in this. So yeah, that's satisfying overall, and I do like. That's one where I'm never quite sure how to rank the Creed movies. We were asked to do that in a Q&A a while back, and I just really wasn't sure. I still think the second one might be my favorite. I felt for a while there like I was in a minority when it first came out with how much I loved Creed 2, but it seems like sort of everybody's kind of come around on that now, and it seems to be pretty universally well liked. Yeah, I mean, I guess they're pretty close to equal ground, all three of them. But I might slightly prefer the second one, with 1 and 3 kind of being on par with each other. So, because the first one kind of had to grow on me a little bit because there was so much hype behind it, but I kind of found an affection for it as I come along. So that's how I feel about those. So let's go ahead and end on My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3, which is basically Nia Vardalos wanting in on the Adam Sandler school of getting paid vacations, and then movies coming out. It's the thing about it is that it was interesting to me that this movie even happened, because the second movie was already clearly running out of ideas. I don't know how many people even remember that there was a second movie. I barely remembered. But I imagine the main reason this one happened was a tribute to Michael Constantine, I think the actor's name was, that played her dad. And I wasn't aware that the actor that played John Corbett's dad apparently has died also, and they kind of mention that a couple of times. There's a nice sort of visual moment at the beginning with like black and white pictures of them, because the whole opening is like, family pictures and stuff like that. And so they do a nice tribute there, and then it seems like the whole movie is kind of a tribute to them in a way. So with that, it's really hard to be, hard on the movie, but it's really not a movie that's necessary. And it's obviously it starts and you're bombarded with callbacks, and I can kind of understand where they might be coming from with that, because it's like you get the idea that like the audience is supposed to feel like part of the family at this point. So when you see all these callbacks, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that because I was there, and it's like it's this involving thing with the audience, I guess, and that's the whole thing about these having audience appeal, is how the first movie was like legendary, and how it was like a word of mouth thing that audiences just absolutely flocked to once the word got out. I remember that phenomenon so vividly, and it was 21 years ago. And like I remember it's the way it progressed up the auditoriums in the theater, and how it got into the bigger and bigger theaters, the bigger the crowds were getting. And that's not something that you can recapture anyway. And so trying to recapture the magic of the movies themselves has not worked out either. We do have Vardalos directing this one also, so it was like, you kind of feel like, and the fact that it's set in Greece, it's like if there'll be more of a personal touch to it. Not really. It still just feels very, like I said, like there weren't a lot of ideas here. All they knew was that they wanted it to be a tribute movie, and they wanted to take the family to Greece, and then from there, it's just kind of a random series of events with not a lot of laughs, not a lot of intriguing conflict, anything like that. Jokes that are kind of all over the place, like when they're coming through and John Corbett says, like, it feels like we went back in time because everything feels so old-fashioned and everything looks so, like it's kept its place in time for centuries or something. And then some guy that's, like, herding sheep pulls out an iPad or something. And it's whatever that joke. It lingered on it for a while, too. It was weird. But then we get moments where, even though they've set that up, which seems to be the opposite of this joke coming up, of course they're going to get to where they're staying and they're going to get settled in. Inevitably, somebody's going to say, there's no Wi-Fi. Because that's what you say in 2023 when you're in a place that doesn't seem caught up with time, even though we just saw a guy with sheep on an iPad in the middle of a field. I don't know. I don't know what that was. But there's also, one of the family members makes like a snarky comment or something, and Nia Vardalos says, that was epic. Like, completely sincerely, and it's not, the joke isn't that she's saying something out of date. She's saying something from, like, 2010. It's like, that's the line, and so it's like, oh, maybe we did travel back in time after all, to 2010 or 2008, or whenever people were saying epic. So it's a lot of stuff like that. We introduced some new characters. There's a cousin named Victory that's kind of a fun character, but she also she keeps saying "sopa" or whatever it is, and we learned that means "shut up." And they say it so many times you can tell they're hoping it becomes like a catchphrase. Like they're hoping people leave the theater saying it and shit like that. It's all very obvious about that. There's also a weird moment where we're introduced to this Syrian girl that becomes a big part of the movie. But the thing about it is, the way she's introduced, she walks into the room, and the way she walks into the room, it's sort of, the music rises, and it's like everything kind of slows down, and you're immediately expecting that cut to another person to show that somebody's falling in love with her, and that's why she's shot that way and why she enters the movie that way. No, there is a character that's in love with her, but he's not in this scene. So they just shot her walking in that way dramatically. So I don't know what that is, but that's just how she walked in. But we do have Paris, who is the daughter of Nia Vardalos and John Corbett in the movie. Tula and Ian, their names I had to remember real quickly. She's now with a guy named... There's no more Alex Wolff from the second movie. She's now with a guy named Aristotle, and they went on like a brief date, but she's super not into him, and they're super not made for each other. Oh, but he's stuck on this trip, and he didn't know she was going to be here. So I would say, where do you think that goes? But the Syrian girl is talking to them and while they're out, and she says, you'll end up together. And it's like, wow, even the characters in the movie are commenting on how fucking predictable this is. And it's... And that's basically what it is. It's a lot of predictable conflicts, but what's even more annoying about these being predictable conflicts are they're conflicts that are all resolved pretty quickly. And the conflicts that are present throughout the movie, I don't even know that I knew were conflicts at the time. Like, I knew people were talking about, like, Nick having the urn with their dad's ashes in it and stuff like that. But I didn't even realize there were conflicts happening here until, like, really late in, where it's like, apparently he smuggled it in and people didn't know he was doing this. I didn't even realize that was going on. I don't know if we were supposed to know, but I don't know. Then there's this really weird addition where there's another family member. But the way they introduce this character, it's another brother in the family. And the way they introduce him is him creeping on Nia Vardalos. She looks out the window, and he's like hiding in the bushes, staring at her directly through the window. And then when she gets Ian's attention because she's scared, he's gone. And then she catches him later creeping on her again. And then it turns out that he's her brother. And then everything from then on is wholesome about this character. they never explain why he was creeping through her window, right up close to her window, and then running away. And that's... I don't know. That does eventually lead to, like, this sort of dating conflict with the Syrian girl and his son. But even that is, like, cleared up really quickly. And so, not that we care about these conflicts anyway, but even if we wanted to, there's no time devoted enough to them, enough to care. So, I don't know what we're supposed to feel about that. But there's also, they get desperate for laughs, so they have some of the characters get drunk. And it's one of those cases where they're really banking on other characters drunkenly laughing, just being contagious laughter, where nothing funny is happening. It's just the characters laughing drunkenly, and it's like they're really hoping the audience is going to play along and do the same thing. Stuff like that feels really desperate. There's this bit with Nick and the shower, where they say, oh, you can take a shower, but it's not warm. And he turns it on and he just, like, screams, and it echoes everywhere. And that's its own scene. And so that feels like it should be some sort of setup or something, or even the punchline to a joke that we didn't see the setup of. But then it turns out that what the punchline of it's going to be is Ian is walking towards the shower, and he's like, oh, hey, the shower's over there, you better go use it. And then we hear Ian scream in the same way. So the thing about that, though, is that the moment where he directs Ian to the shower immediately happens after it's happened to Nick. So it's not like a setup payoff kind of thing. It's the shower's really cold, and then it was really cold again right after that, and then that's the joke. It's just never brought up again. It never happens again. And so I don't know. You can see the desperation for, like, jokes or bits or laughs here or whatever. There's this continuous bit where Nick grossly shaves himself at the dinner table. And that's like, Nick, nudity, is a recurring joke also, and I don't know what they were going for here at all. What basically all this is leading to is another wedding's gonna happen, while they're also having a reunion. And this whole reunion and what they've been trying to do the whole movie with getting, like, her dad's friends back together is all something just done very unceremoniously. It feels like a big ending, but as far as, like, it kind of being the one central conflict that they had, it's just like, I think the movie's ready to end now. This movie is a very, very long hour and a half. It's only an hour and a half, but it's a slog of an hour and a half. So that's really unfortunate, because you want to like it. You know, you want to like the family, because we did before, and Nia Vardalos is always likable, and John Corbett's certainly always been really likable, but I don't know, these movies just really... There was really no reason to continue after the first movie. There's really no ideas you can branch off with this, and there's only so many weddings you can end on, so there's no reason for it to exist. But I understand it being a tribute movie and being heartfelt in that sense, but it's just a nothing movie. So I think that's going to end not just this video, but September. So it's finally time for all this October stuff we've been building up to. I'm relieved, because, like, over half of October is already uploaded to YouTube now. It's all done. It's all shot. It's all ready to go. So I'm going to take a fucking break for a little bit, and then I'll do the rest of the second half of October videos, which you'll see when those come around, when the second half of the month gets here. But in the meantime, let's get into what's probably my favorite time of year, and into all that stuff. So until then, I think that's it.